legendary action star and martial artist Chuck Norris has died.
The 86-year-old passing away suddenly after being taken to hospital in Hawaii.
After his passing, Chuck Norris left behind a Bible with one page worn nearly to nothing, darker than all the rest, stained by decades of the same hands returning to the same passage. In the margin next to a single cluster of verses, in pencil so small you'd need to lean in until you could smell the leather, were 7 words he never once showed to another person. Not in 80 years. The people who finally read them went silent. Then they wept. This is what the toughest man in American culture had been hiding. Not from the world, but from everyone who loved him. And it changes the way you understand every single thing he ever did. The weight of the name. Carlos Ray Norris is born on March 10th, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma. Population just over 1,000. His father, Ray Norris, is a mechanic, a truck driver, and an alcoholic so severe that he disappears for months at a time, sometimes years. His mother, Wilma, raises 3 boys essentially alone, in a house with no running. Water for stretches in a town where poverty is not a condition. It is the weather. Chuck does not talk about this, not in the early years, not for decades. What he does talk about, in interviews that almost nobody watches because they are not funny and do not fit the brand, is the silence. He describes a childhood defined by the absence of a voice, his father's voice, his own voice. He is so shy as a boy that teachers flag him as potentially learning disabled. He does not speak in class. He does not raise his hand. He does not fight back when older kids target him. He describes himself, in his own words, as a skinny, non-athletic kid with no sense of self-worth. That is a direct quote. Write it down, because it matters later. He joins the United States Air Force in 1958, 18 years old, and is stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, a country still scarred by war. It is there that he begins training in Tong Soo-do. Within 2 years, he earns his black belt. Within 5, he is competing at the highest levels of American karate. He wins the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship in 1968 and holds it for 6 consecutive years, retiring undefeated. Not mostly undefeated, undefeated. He opens a chain of martial arts schools. He trains Steve McQueen, Bob Barker, Priscilla Presley. He is not an actor playing a fighter. He is a fighter who learned to act. And here is the part most people skip. Throughout all of it, from the Air Force to the championships to the decades-long movie career, Chuck Norris does not drink. He does not smoke. He does not use drugs. He trains with a discipline that borders on punishment. His publicist of 22 years, a woman named Linda Fuji, says something in a 2014 interview that almost no one picked up on. She says, "Chuck is the most privately tormented man I have ever worked with. Not because of what happened to him, because of what he believes he did to others." She adds, "Facts were his religion long. Before faith was, he measured everything. Calories, training hours, punch speed. He kept notebooks. He recorded everything." When you understand that this is a man who documents, who tracks, who writes things down in margins with a mechanical pencil because ink smudges, you begin to understand why what was found in that Bible was not a casual scribble. It was a confession that took 40 years to write. If you have never heard this part of Chuck Norris's story, you are not alone. Make sure you are subscribed, because what happens next in that woodworking shop is the part that changes everything. The shop on the ranch. The photograph from Navasota does not show a nightstand Bible or a bookshelf Bible. It shows a Bible sitting on a woodworking table in an outbuilding on the Norris Ranch. A building that Gina, Chuck's second wife, tells a visiting pastor is the place Chuck goes when he cannot sleep. She says this casually, the way you mention a well-worn household fact. Chuck cannot sleep. He goes to the shop, he opens the Bible, he reads the same page. This has been happening for years. And here's what stops me cold every time I think about it. The people closest to him, his wife, his adult children, his closest training partners. None of them have ever asked him about that page. Not because they do not care, because they are afraid. Afraid of what the answer might be. Afraid of what it might reveal about a man they thought they had figured out. The Bible is open to the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. If you know your scripture, your stomach just dropped. Isaiah 53 is known across virtually every Christian tradition as the suffering servant passage. It describes a man despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It says he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. Most theologians read it as a prophecy about Jesus Christ. Chuck Norris has read it so many times, the page is nearly translucent. You can see the text bleeding through from the other side, and the wear pattern is not uniform. The bottom third of the page is more worn than the top, which means he was not reading the whole chapter. He was reading the same cluster of verses over and over for decades, verses 4 through 6. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In the margin, next to verse 6, in pencil, in handwriting so small you would need a magnifying glass, the 7 words. The man who read them out loud was named James LaFoon, a pastor from Kingsport, Tennessee, 53 years old, standing in the doorway of a ranch outbuilding in late 2019, still holding the handshake of the woman who walked him there. He has been invited to what was described to him as a small gathering of friends. He is expecting, in his own words, maybe a barbecue and some polite conversation about scripture. He is not expecting this. There are 11 people in the main house. Gina Norris, 2 of Chuck's adult children, a man named Bob Wall, who competed alongside Chuck in the brutal full-contact circuits of the late 1960s, a military chaplain named Colonel David West, who served with Chuck on USO tours between 2001 and 2012, and 6 others whose names have not been made public, but who are described by LaFoon as people who clearly loved this man and were clearly worried about him. Chuck is not in the room when LaFoon arrives. He is in the outbuilding with the Bible. Gina walks LaFoon to the shop without saying much. She opens the door. Chuck is sitting at the woodworking table, the Bible open in front of him, his reading glasses on, a pencil resting in his right hand. He is not writing. He is just sitting there, looking at the page. His shoulders carry the particular stillness of a man who has been very still for a very long time. LaFoon describes the moment in a 2020 interview with a small Christian podcast out of Nashville. He says, "I have been in ministry for 30 years. I have sat with dying men. I have sat with men in prison. I have never walked into a room and felt the weight of silence the way I felt it in that shop." Chuck looks up. He does not say hello. He says, "Can you read something for me?" LaFoon walks to the table. Chuck slides the Bible toward him and points to the margin without speaking. LaFoon leans in, close enough to smell the leather, and reads the 7 words. Here is what nobody tells you about what happened next. LaFoon will not say the exact words publicly, not verbatim. He has said in 2 separate interviews that the words were a question directed at God, written in a syntax that made clear it had been revised many times. The eraser marks around the words were heavy. Chuck had written, erased, rewritten, erased, and rewritten this question over what appeared to be years, possibly decades. The pencil impressions were layered. The question, without quoting it directly, concerned whether the suffering described in Isaiah 53, the bearing of grief, the carrying of sorrow, the chastisement of the peace of others, applied to ordinary men, not to Christ, to fathers, to husbands, to men who had failed and spent their lives trying to carry the weight of that failure alone, in silence, without ever asking whether the silence itself was the sin. Sit with that for a second. You are Chuck Norris. You are the man the entire world turned into a symbol of invincibility. You cannot be hurt. You cannot be broken. You cannot fail. That is the joke. That is the meme. That is the cultural identity 60 years of pop culture has burned into the name Carlos Ray Norris. And every single night, for years, you walk to a small building on your ranch. You open a Bible to a page about a man who was broken, and you ask God, in pencil, in handwriting, so small no one can read it without leaning in close enough to smell the leather, whether your brokenness counts, whether carrying it alone was obedience or cowardice. LaFoon reads the words out loud. His voice catches. He looks at Chuck. Chuck does not move. He just sits there the way he has sat there 1,000 nights before, Then LaFoon does something he says he has never done in 30 years of ministry. He closes the Bible, puts both hands flat on the table, and he weeps. Not a polite tear, he weeps. And Chuck Norris, the man who spent 60 years mastering control over his body, his voice, every visible expression of vulnerability, reaches across the table and puts his hand on the pastor's arm. He says, "I know." That is all. 2 words, "I know." Gina is standing in the doorway. She has been watching the whole time. She later tells Colonel David West, who recounts this in a 2021 chapel service at Fort Bragg, that she had never seen her husband touch another man's arm like that. Not in comfort, not in tenderness. She says, "In 21 years of marriage, I have seen Chuck hold his grandchildren, and I have seen Chuck hold a rifle. The way he holds them is the same, controlled, measured. That day in the shop was the first time I saw his hands shake, the hands that won 6 consecutive karate championships, shaking." The room that broke, the 11 people gather in the main house. LaFoon does not share the exact words. He does not have to. Something has been unsealed, and everyone in the room can feel it. Here's what nobody in that room expected. One by one, without being prompted, without anyone asking, people begin to speak. Bob Wall is sitting near the far end of the room, his forearms resting on the table in front of him, hands folded, the way fighters fold their hands when they are trying to look like they are not holding something. He is 78 years old. He has broken bones in competition without making a sound. He says, "I watched Chuck take a kick to the jaw in 1971 that would have put any man on the floor. He didn't go down, he blinked, he reset, he won the match, and I spent 50 years thinking that was strength." He pauses, his hands stay folded. It wasn't. It was practice. He'd been taking hits his whole life and teaching himself not to fall. That's not strength, that's survival, and there's a difference. And this is where it stops being a faith story and becomes something else entirely. Colonel David West had served with Chuck on 3 separate USO tours between 2001 and 2012. 34 years of service, 2 Bronze Stars. He is standing in the corner of the room with his arms crossed, watching. The way decorated military men watch a room when they are deciding. And whether to speak, he eventually speaks. He says that during a USO tour in Afghanistan in 2004, he shared a tent with Chuck for 3 nights. Picture what that looks like. 2 men in a forward operating base, the kind of silence that only exists when you are very far from home and the stakes are very real. West is a chaplain who has sat with soldiers the night before operations. He knows what it looks like when a man is wrestling with something he cannot put down. Chuck slept no more than 2 hours each night. West watched him sit up on his cot in the dark, open a small travel Bible, and read by flashlight. He asked Chuck what he was reading. Chuck said, "The same thing I always read." West says, "I didn't press it, but I remember thinking, this man is not reading for comfort. He is reading for answers. And the fact that he keeps coming back to the same page tells me he hasn't found them yet." A decorated military chaplain, 34 years of service, 2 Bronze Stars, and he clocked it immediately. He just didn't say it out loud, because some things you do not say to the toughest man in the room at 2 in the morning in Afghanistan. Separately, and this one is the piece that took me a long time to process, a woman named Graham Lynch, the granddaughter of Billy Graham and a faith leader in her own right, recounts meeting Chuck Norris at a private event in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2017. She is standing near a window when Chuck crosses the room toward her. They speak for less than 10 minutes. She says she noticed as they talked that Chuck kept glancing at the door. Not to leave, she thought, but the way a man glances at an exit when the conversation is getting close to something he has kept locked up. Chuck tells her something about her grandfather that she has never heard from anyone else. He says, "Your grandfather once told me that the men who carry the most for others are the ones least likely to set it down." And he looked at her. When he said it, like he was trying to tell her something she was not ready to hear. Lynch says she did not understand the comment at the time. She says that when she later heard about the gathering at the ranch, the Bible, the page, it was like, her exact words, "a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there." What the institutions chose not to see here is the thing that makes this story more than a faith story. Chuck Norris has been a public figure in the American evangelical community for over 30 years. Books, church appearances, Christian television. And in all that time, not one major Christian organization, not one megachurch pastor, not one evangelical media outlet ever addressed what everyone who spent real time with this man apparently already knew, that he was not a pillar of unshakable faith. He was a man in a decades-long wrestling match with God, conducted in pencil, in the margins of a single page, in a language so private that even his wife did not fully understand it until a stranger read it out loud in a woodworking shop. Think about how long that is. Decades, the same page, the same question, never answered out loud. The silence was not malicious, it was institutional convenience. The Chuck Norris of faith media was useful, a tough guy who loves Jesus, which sells books and fills seats and makes the gospel look like victory. The real Chuck Norris did not fit on a bumper sticker. And so, the version of him that was complicated got set aside for the version that was convenient. The institutions that should have seen him, that should have spoken to what he was carrying, chose to use the useful version and ignore the true one. That is not unique to Chuck Norris, but it is particularly devastating here, because the real version of him, the one who could not sleep, the one who asked God in pencil whether his suffering counted, that version would have meant something to an enormous number of men who are doing exactly the same thing right now and believe they are alone in it. When LaFoon later asked Chuck why he had never told anyone about the page, Chuck's answer was 6 words. He said, "Strong men don't ask that question. Let that land." Then, after a long pause, he said something else, something LaFoon has shared publicly only once in that Nashville podcast interview. And I want you to hear every word of this. Chuck said, "My father left. He drank and he drove trucks and he left. And I spent my whole life trying to be the man who didn't leave, the man who stayed, the man who showed up. And I thought that meant being silent. I thought that meant carrying it. I thought that was what Isaiah was talking about, bearing the grief, carrying the sorrow. I thought God was telling me that a real man absorbs the pain and never lets anyone see it." He stopped. He looked at the Bible, now closed on the kitchen counter. But the verse doesn't say that. It says he was wounded for our transgressions, not by our transgressions, for them. There's a difference. And I spent 60 years reading it wrong. I thought I was supposed to be the one suffering. I missed the part where someone had already done it for me. The room is silent. Gina Norris is crying. Bob Wall, 78 years old, a man who has broken bones in competition without making a sound, is sitting with his head in his hands. Colonel West is standing in the corner with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way military men hold themselves when they are trying very hard not to come apart. And Chuck Norris, 80 years old, sitting in a kitchen chair in a ranch house in central Texas, with a worn Bible and a mechanical pencil and 60 years of silence finally cracked open, just sits there, still, the way he has always been still, but different now, lighter, LaFoon says, like something had been set down. What actually happened in that room? Chuck Norris did not have a dramatic conversion that day. He did not renounce his faith or reinvent it. He did not suddenly become a different man. What happened was quieter than that, and in its own way, more devastating. A man who had built his entire identity on never breaking, who had turned that refusal to break into a career, a brand, a global punchline, admitted that the thing he thought was faith was actually fear. Fear of being his father, fear of being weak, fear of needing grace. Because needing grace meant admitting you could not carry it yourself. And admitting you could not carry it yourself meant you were the kind of man who leaves. He was not that man. He never was. But the terror of becoming that man drove 60 years of silence, 60 years of sleepless nights, 60 years of opening a Bible to the same page and asking a question he was too afraid to answer out loud. Here's what nobody tells you about the men who look the most unbreakable. The discipline is real. The toughness is real. But sometimes, underneath it, there is a child who watched his father's truck disappear down a road in Ryan, Oklahoma, and decided, silently, permanently, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure he was not the one who drove away. Chuck did that. He stayed. He showed up. By almost every measure that matters, he was the man he set out to be. But he read the wound wrong. He thought he was the one who was supposed to carry it. He was not. And here is what that costs. 60 years of not sleeping. 60 years of walking to a shop in the dark because the house feels too quiet and too full at the same time. 60 years of a mechanical pencil and an eraser, and 7 words that got written and rewritten until the paper was nearly worn through. That is not discipline. That is a man trapped inside a theology he built out of his own fear and could not find his way out of alone. Colonel West, at that Fort Bragg chapel service in 2021, said something I keep coming back to. He said that it's his 34 years of service, he had sat with men before combat who were afraid of dying, and men after combat who were afraid of having lived, of what they had done, of who they had become. He said Chuck Norris reminded him of the second kind, not afraid of the world, afraid of himself, afraid of the version of himself that, given the wrong conditions, might have been his father. That fear made him extraordinary. It also cost him 60 years of nights. Gina says he still goes to the shop some nights. He still opens the book, but he does not sit as long. And when he comes back to the house, he does not come back the way he used to, silent and heavy and measured. He comes back and he talks, sometimes about nothing, sometimes without the Bible. Sometimes he just stands in the kitchen and looks at her, and she looks at him, and neither of them says a word. But the silence is different now. It is not a wall, it is a window, and the pencil stays in the drawer. The questions that remain. 2 questions stay with me, and I want to be honest. I do not have the answers. The first is personal. How many men are sitting in the dark right now, in workshops and garages and parked cars, carrying something they believe they are not allowed to set down, reading the same page over and over, looking for permission that was there all along? The second is larger, and it is the one that keeps me up. If the toughest man in American popular culture spent 60 years misreading the most important passage in his Bible, if he got the direction of the wound wrong, mistaking wounded for as wounded by, mistaking substitution for obligation, what else have we been reading wrong? What other verses have we turned into chains and called them crowns? What other silences are we praising as strength when they are, in fact, the longest and slowest way a man can leave? Chuck Norris's Bible is still in that outbuilding. The page is still worn. The 7 words are still there in pencil, layered over years of erasing and rewriting. The man who wrote them spent 60 years believing he was not allowed to say them out loud. And then, one night in a woodworking shop in Navasota, Texas, with a pastor he had never met and a wife watching from a doorway, he finally let someone read them. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man keeping a secret. It was the silence of a man who had finally been heard. Drop a comment below. Which question hit you harder, the personal one or the cosmic one? And subscribe now, because next week we are covering the sealed letter Billy Graham left with instructions that it not be opened until 20 years after his death. 2028 is approaching, and someone has already talked.